50 years after the Vietnam War ends, a trade war begins. The Vietnamese remember this day in 1975 as a victory over foreign imperialism that eventually led to an economic rebirth. But after decades of growth, Vietnam is again at odds with the U.S. as President Trump imposes massive tariffs on the country's crucial exports. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is Vietnam. U.S. President Donald Trump paused tariffs on Vietnam for 90 days, which has left factories there scrambling to export as much as possible before they kick in. The timing corresponds ominously with the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, a reminder of what many Vietnamese see as the worst example of foreign aggression against their country. Millions were killed, while generations to follow felt the severely disabling effects of Agent Orange and cluster munitions. Today, though far less devastating to life and limb, the U.S. has now declared war again, but this time on Vietnam's economy, planning 46% tariffs on the export-dependent nation. Here's a look now at their complex relationship.
50 years ago, as the war ended, Vietnam had been torn apart. Its land scarred, its people shattered by the weight of their struggle, but buoyed by victory over America. Today, it stands as a symbol of resilience, its economy booming, its place on the global stage solidifying. But behind the optimism, the ghosts of war linger, casting long shadows over Vietnam's future.
In a world of increasingly complex and unpredictable developments, and as a nation having suffered so much loss and pain from past wars, we are deeply aware of the value of peace, independence, and freedom.
Peace is often measured by what's no longer visible. But for these young residents of Vietnam, peace is a lack of fear, an everyday defiance against a legacy of destruction.
To me, peace is when you hear the roar of helicopters, but you run toward them to watch, instead of hiding under the table.
After the war, the Vietnamese were quick to look towards a future, not defined by the conflict that once consumed it, but by the complicated challenges ahead. A world that demands strength not just in arms, but in commerce. And it faced many complexities in its relationships with its neighbours. The country fought a border war with China just a few decades ago, making it clear that Vietnam is no mere pawn in China's hands. Instead, it has long pursued its independence, even against one of the world's most powerful nations. But as Vietnam celebrates its peace, a new kind of conflict brews on the horizon: economic warfare. Vietnam's rise as an economic powerhouse has been nothing short of remarkable. Once synonymous with war, it's now at the heart of Asia's manufacturing boom. But this growth is built on a delicate balance. While the US and China battle it out over tariffs, it's Vietnam that could feel the deepest effects. The US has announced 46% trade tariffs on the country, which would pummel its export-reliant economy. And in addition, the US has also recently proposed a devastating 3,520% tariff on solar cells from Southeast Asia, targeting an industry that has become vital to Vietnam's economy.
Now, with the trade and tariff issues in place, is a big question mark. What is it that US wants to achieve in Asia, where the strategic competition with China is still going on the way we understood it, or it is a purely, through the lens of economic competition, and tariffs will be the main avenue of that competition.
The irony is striking. 50 years after the war, Vietnam finds itself once again locked in a battle. But this time it's not bombs falling, but tariffs rising. An economic war that will test the very resilience that Vietnam has fought so hard to build.
So, could Trump's tariff war undo the hard-fought reconciliation that took decades for the U.S. and Vietnam to build? Joining me now to debate that and much more are from Singapore, member of the Advisory Reform Committee for Ho Chi Minh Leadership, Vu Minh Quong, From Canberra, Emeritus Professor of Politics at the University of New South Wales, Carlisle Thayer. And from Washington, former U.S. Army captain and author of several books on the Vietnam War, George J. Weitz. Thanks all so much for being with me. I'd just like to begin with remembering what happened 50 years ago. So, Vu Minh Quang, how large does the memory of the Vietnam War loom over the country today?
I think it's very large and in a very positive way. Actually, it gives the people a big pride of thinking about our victory over the Americans and reunited our country. And today is a wonderful day. So the big, wonderful parade and very much actually enthusiasm of people from all over the country coming here to celebrate the great celebration here. And definitely, we do believe that we can make even more remarkable achievement in the time to come. So Vietnam actually have experienced the 4 decades of reform and making remarkable achievement. So right now, we compare ourselves against a country like Russia or Ukraine. We actually proud that actually the leadership have chosen the right direction in working closely with the international community and make actually integrating into the world very extensively. And we now believe that over the next 2 decades, Vietnam will become a high-income nation, and the nation make every effort to make it happen.
Okay, let me ask Carlisle Thayer, if you're on the same page there. I mean, many have described the Vietnamese as particularly pragmatic people, but 50 years after the war, do they fully, and you're speaking as an observer, of course, do they fully trust Americans?
Well, in the interest of full disclosure, I'm an American, but I'm a naturalized Australian, and I've been living in this country since '71. But I'm a son of an American military officer and grew up, and I was in Vietnam, 1967, 68. I published an article today that I think summarizes it. It's a government policy, but it's what Vietnamese said, bygones be bygones. I'm 80 years old this year, so that war and the end of the war, has affected me and my particular generation. And here in Australia, we will have a small group of people who see it as a day of shame, and a larger group in the Vietnamese community that view it in very positive terms. And the stress this year is really on reconciliation between the regime and Vietnamese living abroad, and between the regime and former foes, the U.S. A very important speech, article by the party secretary general to that effect.
Interesting that you say that, because it does seem that it's the Vietnamese diaspora that's been a bit harder to win over. You know, there's surprisingly for some, there are a lot of Donald Trump supporters among the Vietnamese refugee community in the United States. I'm curious about what you think about them today and the fact that they support Donald Trump, especially in the face of this declared trade war on Vietnam that could actually hinder Vietnamese economic growth and hurt friends and family members that may be back in the country.
Well, I think George is more up to date. It's been over a year or more since I've been back. I'm well aware, though, when I return, because I meet both communities in that. And it's, I tell the Vietnamese in my own experience, and so I'm a Yankee, that took over 100 years for us to overcome the Civil War. I still don't like the Southern Confederate flag being flown. And they're going to have to go through that too. And so there's attitudes that persist and are passed on from generation. But I think the bulk of the overseas Vietnamese community, yes, they are, is and are, I mean, the evidence is there. The number of visas that are issued from Australia, from the U.S. of returnees that go back to Vietnam, the ease of doing that.
Okay.
We have reached reconciliation.
Okay, well, let me turn to George. And George, I have to admit, I was reluctant to come to you. We might have a problem with your connection. But yeah, please do comment on the kind of exchange you just heard. And as well as, well, go on.
Well, you're absolutely correct in terms of the attempt by the Communist party class to create some reconciliation. I, having deep ties to the Viet Q community here in America, I think that's a very long road to hoe. I think Dr. Carlisle's analogy about this American Civil War is probably very accurate. I think a lot of them are looking for a lot more concrete examples. They do not take the communist government at their word. And I think one of the first ones that would be very helpful would be some of the things in terms of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Saigon, Ho Chi Minh City, restoring things in Benoit Cemetery. So they're looking for more concrete examples than just words.
Okay. And let me ask you this, George. I mean, I have to say, most tragically, as per the war, both countries ended up with, thousands and thousands of physically and psychologically wounded people. In the US, many Vietnam veterans became homeless. They're suffering still from severe mental illness, those who've lived this long. While in Vietnam, you have those who were, maimed by Agent Orange and landmines, for example. They still suffer today. So what have been, if you can comment on the generational implications of that suffering, those injuries in both countries? And I mean, had there ever been anything like that before?
You see in the Vietnamese community one of two things. First off, so many of them who came from Vietnam, especially in their early years, sort of just put the past behind them, let's move forward. The families, the parents in particular, are very focused on building a new life for themselves and for their children, and they've been extraordinarily successful. But then you see another generation of people who, especially the guys whose education camps, many of whom never got over that trauma, and you could just see that they're mentally and physically much weaker than the people who got out in 1975 or a little bit later.
Okay, let me ask Quang really the same question and what you've witnessed as far as generational damage that has been done, both physically and psychologically, to survivors.
I think actually the big improvement in recent years and after the achievement of reforms become more vivid, many actually overseas Vietnamese coming home to help the country and share the vision that Vietnam will be a powerful country over the next 2 or 3 decades. So I see the people who even the children of the soldier killed during the war working actually fighting for the southern government, but now coming back because they are leading expert on semiconductors and other industry. They're coming back and very actually supportive to the government plan to build a strong Vietnam into the future. Because for the Vietnamese, survival of the country on one way actually the top priority in our agenda and in their life. So and they also look for actually national pride. So the war actually is painful, but it's the past. So the Vietnamese people emphasize that we are actually very forward-looking people. So treating people, especially the American one, like a very good friend, if not a closest friend. So people are thinking about the Vietnamese, the Americans this day in very positive way.
Right. So you speak of the development, the economic growth, the pragmatism. So, I mean, how do you view this now declared trade war? I mean, do you see the U.S. now as a hostile partner here or an adversary for Vietnam today? Or is this just something that you can adapt to and work with?
Actually, not at all. In Vietnam, you really understand actually what the President Donald Trump doing, because he's actually facing two things. One, actually, structural problem, the huge deficit of the U.S. economy. They actually export only more than $1,000 billion, but import more than $3,000. So deficit is big and increasing. So definitely they have to deal with this problem decisively. But at the same time, the President Donald Trump actually very good in causing some kind of psychological shock. So we understand that at the end of the day, the tariff will be actually settled down across country. Of course, Vietnam have to give them a lot of concession, but in a very fair way. So our negotiation team now in Washington, D.C., but we believe that actually the Americans are very fair to the world eventually. So yeah, actually don't feel any problem so far. Not really as yet.
Okay, I mean, that sounds quite optimistic, Carlisle. Are you on the same page there? Or, I mean, or do you think that this is, for as resilient as the Vietnamese people can be, this is going to be a tough thing to deal with, this kind of attack on their export economy?
Right, but I see Vietnam as a first mover here. To Lam, their general secretary, got to speak to Donald Trump, was one of the first international leaders when he was elected. Then he's had a recent telephone conversation that Donald Trump said was productive, in which he offered to reduce tariffs to zero, but also called on the United States to reciprocate. And then from that, we've had the Ministry of Industry and Trade and a deputy prime minister from Vietnam make contacts, and more recently with the U.S. Trade Representative, Greer, they've now moved from the framework to technical talks. So it's being held and being done very, very pragmatically. And a former student of mine who's a retired diplomat has written a very major piece, and it's very typically Vietnamese. It's published in Singapore, Fulcrum, saying this is an opportunity for us to do another reform of all the barriers to trade that we have, and to look at all our regulations and go through and open up new markets, make all our free trade agreements even freer, fill up supply chain. In other words, find the opportunity and the challenge, because you got overdependence on the U.S. Now you're paying a price. Use this opportunity, because as Professor Kuang was saying, Vietnam has goals for 2030 to be a middle-income country, relatively high income, and go beyond. And it's only with science, technology, innovation, and moving up the production line. No longer apparel and footwear, but high-class stuff. So they need America. They're comprehensive strategic partners. And let's get through this period of negotiation. They're from the very beginning, hold your powder, don't take retaliation, let's just deal with it pragmatically. And the Prime Minister set up a major task force headed by their foreign minister, who, by the way, was educated at Columbia University. They're very pragmatic and they're keen. And I'm saying they had to deal with Moscow versus Beijing in the Cold War period. Yeah. They know how to deal with difficult partners.
Okay, it's interesting that both of you see this as, an opportunity of sorts, and that, pragmatism is the word of the day, because there are others that say, George, I'll come to you, that this is the U.S. putting Vietnam in an incredibly difficult position, between China and the United States. But it almost sounds like our other panelists see this as an advantageous position, perhaps with China, who's going to need Vietnam even more, and that Vietnam is in the advantageous position.
Well, I certainly agree that tariffs are important in this to readdress that trade part, but I think that's only half the equation. I think there is the trade deficit between Vietnam and America. I think that's really what Trump is going for. And so I think what happens is that now you've seen discussions about Vietnam purchasing more American goods. I've seen rumors about F-16s, military stuff. I'll believe that when it happens. So I think what's the tariffs are only half.
Okay, we seem to be having trouble with your connection, George. But let me come back to Quang then. I mean, where do you see the Vietnam-China relationship then off the back of these negotiations with the United States? Would that be a relationship that could grow off the back of this, or would the Vietnamese rather see a better partnership with the United States?
Actually, our strategy here actually moving closely to both elephants. So in our strategy, you should not actually take side. So we try to work closely with the US and working closely with China, and try to encourage them to work together for the betterment of our own country and for the region and for the world. So we are very much positive in this way, and we see the reward. So today, for example, we can see the soldier of China actually in the parades, but we are also actually working quite closely with the US. So definitely, we don't want to hurt one party by working closely with another one. So in our strategy, again, we want to move closer to both and leverage our strength as being very sincere, very practical, and very forward-looking.
Well, let me ask you then more specifically. I mean, if again, I'm very impressed with how optimistic you sound on this, what people have declared a trade war going forward. But there's specifically the issue of solar panels, for example, that have been almost fundamental to the Vietnamese economy and the technology sector and its growth. You're looking at something like 3,000%, if I'm not mistaken, tariffs on just the solar panel industry. Do you not see that as, rather provocative and just outright unfair? Or are you again seeing that as an opportunity to negotiate harder with a good trade partner in Washington?
Actually, President Donald Trump imposed very high tariff on solar panel, for example, but across country. So for Vietnam, we just worry about some uneven treatment here. If they actually very harsh on the country, it shouldn't be a problem for Vietnam, because the Vietnamese is very resourceful and figuring out how to overcome the problem successfully. So the panel, solar panel, it's just a short-term thing. So we closely actually monitor the situation. But in my experience working with the Vietnamese leadership and the people, I see that we should be very practical and don't want to cause any panic among the investor, whatever. And during this time, we'll be working very closely with the investor, enhancing the trust of the investment community in the country, in the system. So we can see a huge, actually remarkable reform in Vietnam this day. So right after the holidays here, Vietnam will actually have a national assembly session to approve a new constitution so that we can consolidate the provinces and prepare for the next leaf of reform.
Okay. Well, let me ask Carlisle then, because, I mean, one of the dynamics of Trump's trade war, many had said earlier on that his trade war on China was actually going to benefit Vietnam and other production countries, whereby the production would just be moved to Malaysia or Vietnam, obviously. And now that's not the case. The Trump administration is looking at making sure everyone is punished for not reciprocating with this equality, even though many say there's really no symmetry here anyway. But still, it puts Vietnam in a very difficult situation because they're not even going to be able to position themselves as a third-party manufacturing country.
Yeah, but we've been just talking as if Vietnam didn't belong to ASEAN, and other solar panel tariffs have been put on Cambodia, Malaysia, and Thailand. ASEAN, as a group of 10 nations, is the 5th largest trading bloc in the world. So Vietnam has some wiggle room, and there's already rumors anyway, reports some of they're going to lose to India because the tariffs aren't as high and people can manufacture phones and do other things in that. So it's one, we have to see what ASEAN's going to do, and their ministers have said no retaliation. They've got to negotiate. So Vietnam isn't alone. But I'd like to introduce a new thing. Within 150 days of coming into office, the Trump administration is supposed to come up with a national security strategy. And what I would hope is that all the principals, defense secretaries, Secretary of State, their aperture would have to be widened to come up with that document and get beyond just looking at trade tariffs and what Trump is doing and really pose the larger question: what are America's strategic interests and how does Vietnam fit in?
Yeah.
And that's what's missing in this conversation.
Okay. I mean, well, I'll have George comment on that as well. What about U.S. national security strategy and all of this, particularly in the South China Sea? But I mean, having said that, Trump has indicated he really doesn't want much to do with what he thinks is a problem for Asia to deal with within its neighbors.
Well, you're right. And in my conversations with senior State Department officials, they're impressed that the Trump administration security policy with Vietnam is going to be very similar to what it was from the first administration and a continuance of what Biden was doing, which was maintaining sort of been building on soft power to contain China. Vietnam is never going to move closer to the United States in terms of a military alliance. So their only option really then is sort of the soft power move to help them contain the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea.
Elaborate on that, though. How can this boil down to soft power?
Well, they're going to try and continue United Nations. They're going to continue legal aspects. They're going to try and build sort of a soft power alliance with you see Vietnam moving a little bit closer to the Philippines now. is the Japanese are resurrecting things. So it's also a move of trying to create a sort of a non-military alliance, non-ASEAN, that will help sort of present to China this unified alliance that is against the continuing buildup of the Chinese military in the South China Sea. And you see Vietnam itself now starting to militarize. I think there's a reef out near Spratlys that they're sort of building on.
Carlisle, very quickly, Carlisle, would you agree that that's how it's unfolding?
Well, we had Secretary Hegseth go to the Philippines and resume $500,000 of aid, military aid, and using the word deterrence. We have the sale of F-16s to Taiwan, to the Philippines, and now the rumored one about Vietnam, and I see a particular pattern there. And Vietnam is a security partner, yes. It's clear. They have a four-nose policy. No military alliance, no foreign bases, no ganging up against another country, and no first use of force. And that's why when Professor Kuang was talking, he would say they do both. They have a policy of cooperation and struggle. Cooperate with China and the U.S., and where they trample on your interests, push back.
Okay, that will have to be the final word for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on social media, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey, and we'll see you next time.